Before Rome had a senate, before Greece had a philosophy, before the words civilization had even been spoken in Europe, there was a kingdom on the Nile that had already built pyramids, crowned kings, smelted iron, and traded gold across 3 continents. Its name was Kush, and history almost let you forget it entirely. The story of human civilization is far older, far wider, and far deeper than the version most of us were handed in school. For generations, the textbooks pointed east, to Greece, to Rome, to Mesopotamia, and declared that that was where the great experiment of organized human society began. But the evidence, carved in stone, buried in sand, and pulled from the earth by archaeologists over the past century, tells a very different story. Along the banks of the Nile, south of ancient Egypt, in the region now known as Sudan, a civilization rose, expanded, and ruled for over 1,000 years. It sent armies into Egypt. It placed its own pharaohs on the throne of the most powerful nation on earth. It built more pyramids than Egypt ever did, and it did all of this before Rome had laid a single stone on its 7 hills. This is not mythology, this is not legend, this is documented history, confirmed by Egyptian inscriptions, Assyrian war records, Greek geographical accounts, and decades of modern archaeological excavation. What you are about to hear is the factual, verified story of the Kingdom of Kush. If you have never heard this story, stay, because what you are about to witness rewrites everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. Subscribe, share this, and pay attention. The year is approximately 2500 BCE. Rome does not yet exist. Athens is a small settlement. The Great Pyramids of Giza have only just been completed in Egypt to the north. And in the Upper Nile Valley, in what is today northern Sudan, a people known as the Kushites are already building a complex, stratified society. The Kingdom of Kush emerged from the ancient region called Nubia, a stretch of land running roughly from the first cataract of the Nile near Aswan, southward through modern Sudan. This was not empty desert. The Nile Valley here was fertile, strategic, and extraordinarily rich. Gold deposits ran through its eastern hills, ivory came from its forests, copper, ebony, and cattle passed through its trade routes. Whoever controlled Nubia controlled the supply lines of the ancient world. The earliest known Kushite political center was established at Kerma, near the third cataract of the Nile. The Kerma culture, as archaeologists call it, dates to approximately 2500 BCE, making it one of the oldest urban civilizations in sub-Saharan Africa. Swiss archaeologist Charles Bonnet, who excavated the site at Kerma for decades, confirmed the existence of massive mud brick structures, elite burials containing thousands of sacrificed retainers, and a complex palace architecture that rivals anything found in Egypt during the same period. These were not scattered tribal camps, these were cities. Organized, hierarchical, monument-building cities with a ruling class, a priesthood, a military, and a trading economy that reached from Central Africa to the Mediterranean coast. Around 1700 BCE, Egypt expanded southward and colonized much of Nubia, absorbing Kushite culture and resources. For several centuries, Kush existed under Egyptian influence, but this was not the end of the Kushite story. It was, in fact, only the beginning of its most extraordinary chapter. When Egypt weakened, fractured by internal conflict, foreign invasion, and political collapse, the Kushites did not simply inherit the vacuum, they seized it. By the 10th century BCE, a new Kushite kingdom had consolidated power at a city called Napata, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, a site the Kushites regarded as the earthly home of the god Amun. This was the beginning of the Napatan period, and it marked the transformation of Kush from a regional power into a continental empire. The Kushite military at this stage was formidable. Kushite archers had been legendary throughout the ancient world for centuries. Egyptian records refer to Nubia simply as Ta-Seti, meaning land of the bow. Kushite warriors served as mercenaries in Egyptian armies for generations. Now that military tradition was about to be turned against Egypt itself. Around 760 BCE, a Kushite king named Kashta began pushing northward into Egyptian territory. His successor, Pa, also rendered in historical records as Pianki, completed the conquest. In approximately 727 BCE, Pa launched a full military campaign into Egypt, defeated the fragmented Egyptian rulers of the Third Intermediate Period, and was proclaimed pharaoh of all Egypt. This was not a raid, this was not a border skirmish, this was a total military conquest of the most powerful civilization in the known world by an African king from the south. The evidence for this is not disputed. Pa erected a granite victory stela, a large inscribed stone monument at the Temple of Amun at Napata, detailing the campaign. It was discovered by archaeologists in 1862 and is now housed in the Cairo Museum. The stela records, in the pharaonic tradition, the cities taken, the rulers who submitted, and the religious devotion Pa brought to his conquest. He describes himself washing himself in the Nile in Memphis, offering to the gods at their temples, and conducting himself not as a foreign invader, but as the rightful restorer of Egyptian religious order. Pa founded what Egyptologists call the 25th dynasty of Egypt, known also as the Nubian dynasty or the Kushite dynasty. Under his successors, Shabaka, Shebetku, Taharka, and Tantamani, Kush ruled Egypt for nearly a century, from approximately 747 BCE to 656 BCE. Taharka, who reigned from 690 to 664 BCE, is perhaps the most well-documented of these rulers. He is mentioned by name in the Hebrew Bible, in the Second Book of Kings and the Book of Isaiah, in the context of his military confrontation with the Assyrian Empire. He built or restored temples across Egypt and Nubia, from the Delta in the north to Kawa and Barkal in the south. His building program was among the most extensive of any pharaoh in the late period of Egyptian history. Under Taharka, Egyptian culture, architecture, and religious practice were not suppressed, they were revitalized. He saw himself not as a foreign occupant, but as the legitimate heir of the pharaonic tradition. The wealth that funded this empire came from Kush's extraordinary natural resources. The Nubian gold mines, particularly those of the eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea, were among the richest in the ancient world. Egyptian records from earlier periods are filled with accounts of gold tribute extracted from Nubia. Under independent Kushite rule, that gold stayed in Kushite hands and built Kushite monuments. The civilization also controlled the trade routes connecting sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean, routes carrying ivory, ebony, incense, and exotic animals that the ancient world's elites desperately wanted. Kush was not merely a military power, it was an economic engine that drove commerce across northeastern Africa for centuries. The collision between Kush and Assyria was, for its time, a clash between two of the most powerful military forces on Earth. The Assyrian Empire, based in what is now northern Iraq, was the dominant military machine of the Near East in the 7th century BCE. Its armies were disciplined, technologically advanced, and brutal in their methods. They had already dismantled the Kingdom of Israel, deported entire populations, and reduced city after city across the Levant to rubble. In 701 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib moved against the Kingdom of Judah. The Hebrew king Hezekiah appealed for help. It was Taharka, then still a prince, commanding Kushite and Egyptian forces, who marched north to confront the Assyrian advance. The biblical account in 2 Kings 19:9 records that Sennacherib, hearing that Taharka was coming to fight him, paused his siege of Jerusalem. Whatever the outcome of that particular confrontation, the historical record confirms that Kush was capable of projecting military power deep into the Near East, over 1,000 miles from its homeland. The direct Assyrian invasion of Egypt came under Sennacherib's son, Esarhaddon. In 671 BCE, Esarhaddon's forces pushed into Egypt, captured Memphis, and forced Taharka to retreat south into Nubia. The Assyrian king erected a victory stela depicting Taharka's son in chains at his feet. But Taharka was not finished. He counterattacked and briefly retook Memphis. The struggle continued under his successor, Tantamani, who launched his own campaign northward and killed an Assyrian-backed ruler in Egypt. The Assyrian response was overwhelming. Their king Ashurbanipal sent an army that drove deep into Upper Egypt, sacking the city of Thebes in 663 BCE, an act so shocking that it is referenced in the biblical book of Nahum as a symbol of catastrophic destruction. The Kushite dynasty was driven permanently from Egypt. Tantamani retreated south to Napata, and Egyptian rule passed to a native dynasty backed by Assyrian power. The loss of Egypt was a military and political defeat of the highest order, but it did not destroy Kush. The kingdom retreated to its heartland and survived and thrived for another 1,000 years. Around the 4th century BCE, the Kushite capital moved further south to Meroe, a city situated between the 5th and 6th cataracts of the Nile in what is now central Sudan. The Meroitic period, as scholars call it, represented a cultural and economic renaissance. The Kushites developed their own written script, Meroitic, which remains only partially deciphered today. They built hundreds of steep-sided pyramids across the desert landscape. They developed sophisticated iron-smelting technology at a time when iron was the most strategically important material on Earth. Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, described Meroe as a great city. Diodorus Siculus and Herodotus both wrote about the Ethiopians, a term ancient Greek writers used broadly to describe the people of sub-Saharan Africa, including the Kushites, with a mixture of awe and respect unusual in ancient geographic literature. The Meroitic kingdom endured until approximately the 4th century CE, over 1,000 years after the Assyrian expulsion from Egypt. It was finally conquered around 350 CE by the Kingdom of Aksum, a rising power from what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. The Aksumite king Ezana recorded this conquest in inscriptions that survive to this day. By this point, Rome had risen, peaked, and was already fracturing. The Roman Empire would formally collapse in the West within a century of Kush's fall. The civilization that Rome never conquered, never fully understood, and only partially documented had outlasted Roman dominance in the Mediterranean world. And yet, for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, Kush barely appeared in the history books taught in European and American schools. The reasons for this omission are not difficult to trace. The European colonial project required a historical narrative in which Africa was a continent without history, a land of primitive peoples awaiting civilizing influence from the outside. A kingdom that had ruled Egypt confronted the Assyrian Empire, built more pyramids than the Egyptians, and sustained an urban civilization for 2,000 years was profoundly inconvenient for that narrative. The early European archaeologists working in Sudan in the 19th century sometimes attributed Meroitic and Napatan achievements to external influences, Egyptian, Arab, or otherwise, rather than to indigenous African development. This interpretive bias has been systematically dismantled over the past several decades by a new generation of scholars, many of them African and Sudanese, who have returned to the archaeological record with different questions and different frameworks. The pyramids of Meroe still stand today, 200 of them rising from the Sudanese desert in clusters, steeper and slender than their Egyptian counterparts. The temples at Musawarat as Sufra, the palace ruins at Kerma, the inscribed stelae of Napata, all of it is documented, excavated, and increasingly understood. The Meroitic language is the subject of ongoing scholarly decipherment. UNESCO has designated the Meroitic archaeological sites as a World Heritage Site. The stones were never lost, only the story told about them was. The Kingdom of Kush was not a footnote, it was not a tributary, it was not an offshoot of Egypt or a distant imitation of Mediterranean greatness. It was an original, sovereign, deeply rooted African civilization that governed itself, built its own monuments, wrote its own language, fought its own wars, and shaped the course of ancient history for over 2,000 years. When Pi's army crossed the Egyptian border in 727 BCE and claimed the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, Rome was not yet a city. When Taharqa rebuilt the temples of Karnak and Kawa, the Roman Forum was still marshland. When the pyramids of Meroe were still being constructed under Kushite kings and queens, Julius Caesar had not yet been born. The facts are not in dispute. The timeline is documented. The monuments are standing. What has been missing is not the evidence, it is the willingness to look. History is written by the victors. It is curated by those with the power to decide what gets taught in classrooms, printed in textbooks, and broadcast as the story of humanity. But history is also written in granite and gold. It is written in iron smelted at Meroe, in the victory stela of Pi, in the pyramids that still pierce the Sudanese sky at a place called Begroia. Those do not disappear because someone chose not to mention them. The Kingdom of Kush built one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. It did so on its own terms, in its own land, with its own gods, its own language, and its own kings. And it was doing all of this gloriously, powerfully, and permanently long before Rome rose. Share this video, because the world was never what they told you it was, and someone you know needs to hear that. Subscribe for more history that has been buried, because the past belongs to everyone.